Something big just happened. For weeks, the country's been frozen, paychecks stopped, benefits halted, tension rising like a pressure valve is about to burst. But then, out of nowhere, the silence broke. A single order was given direct, final, and unmistakable. Airspace sealed over the Caribbean. F-35 seconds scrambled into formation. Naval vessels repositioned off Venezuela's coast, and at the same time, in U.S. cities, protesters clashed with ICE agents, trying to pull detainees from federal vans. Chaos on the streets, confusion in Congress, and panic spreading through the media. And through it all, one thing became clear. The so-called shutdown crisis wasn't just about government funding, it was about control. Because while opponents were focused on partisan drama, the administration was quietly executing a coordinated strategy against narco-terror networks that stretched from Venezuela to the U.S. border. A move that stunned critics, cornered protest leaders, and forced even Washington insiders to admit someone just outmaneuvered everyone. Let's break down exactly what just happened, what order Trump just gave, and how the protesters and their allies never saw it coming. Right now, we're watching one of the most intricate operations in recent political memory unfold in real time. It's day 31 of the government shutdown, and if you've been following along, you know things have reached a breaking point. Picture this. More than 13,000 air traffic controllers haven't seen a paycheck in over a month. Federal union workers, thousands of them, are in the same boat. Airports are operating on fumes. Safety inspectors are stretched thin. And then there's the issue that hits closest to home for millions of families, SNAP benefits, the food assistance program that helps put groceries on the table for over 40 million Americans. November 1st was supposed to be the day those benefits rolled out again. But the shutdown meant that for the first time in decades, families across the country were staring at empty mailboxes and wondering how they'd feed their kids. Now, think about what that does to a nation's psyche. When people can't rely on the basic functions of government, when safety, stability, and even food security are suddenly in question, frustration doesn't just simmer, it boils over. And that's exactly where we were. The pressure valve I mentioned, it was about to blow. But here's where it gets interesting. Because while the media was focused on the theatrics in Congress, the partisan finger-pointing, the endless debate over who was to blame, something else was happening behind closed doors. A decision was being made, one that would shift the entire landscape overnight. And when that decision came down, it wasn't a compromise. It wasn't a negotiation. It was an order. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where the rules felt like they were holding you back? Maybe you were trying to get something important done, helping a neighbor, organizing a community event, dealing with bureaucracy, and you hit a wall. Not because your idea was bad, but because the process itself was designed to slow everything down. That's what the Senate filibuster is, in a nutshell. It's a procedural rule that requires 60 votes to move most legislation forward. And in a divided government, that's a nearly impossible threshold to meet. So, what do you do when the clock is ticking, when millions of people are counting on you, and the old rules are grinding everything to a halt? You change the rules. That's exactly what Trump authorized. He gave the order to activate what Washington insiders called the nuclear option. Now, don't let the name scare you. It's not about actual weapons. It's about eliminating the filibuster for budgetary matters, allowing the Senate to pass a continuing resolution with just 50 votes plus the vice president's tiebreaker. In other words, it's about cutting through the gridlock. And before you think this is some radical new move, let me remind you, the nuclear option has been used before. In fact, it's been invoked by Democrats more than once in recent history. When they needed to push through judicial appointments or legislative priorities, they didn't hesitate. So when people clutch their pearls and say, but what if the other side uses this against us later? Well, they already have. And they promise to do it again the next time they're in power. So the question isn't whether this tactic will be used. The question is, who's going to use it first when it actually matters? Now, I want you to think about something for a moment. Leadership isn't just about making popular decisions. It's about making necessary ones. And sometimes the necessary decision is the one that upsets the established order. Because the established order, if we're being honest, wasn't serving the people anymore. It was serving itself. And when you're dealing with a crisis that's affecting tens of millions of lives, You don't have the luxury of waiting for consensus. You act. That's what Trump did. He looked at the paralysis in Washington, the suffering spreading across the country, and the political games being played with people's livelihoods, and he said, enough. We're moving forward. And here's the thing, whether you agree with him or not, you have to admit this. It worked. The Senate moved. The gridlock broke. And suddenly, the conversation shifted from, will the government ever reopen, to what happens next. But, and this is a big but, the domestic political maneuvering was only half the story. Because while all eyes were on Capitol Hill, another battlefield was being set, and this one wasn't in Washington. It was in the Caribbean. Have you ever noticed how sometimes the biggest moves happen when everyone's looking somewhere else? It's a principle that applies to everything from business strategy to geopolitics. Distract your opponent with one hand while the other hand sets the real play in motion. And that's exactly what unfolded here. While the media was obsessing over the shutdown drama, interviewing furloughed workers, covering protest marches, dissecting every tweet the Pentagon was quietly mobilizing, airspace near Puerto Rico closed. F-35 fighter jets scrambled and stationed. Naval assets repositioned along key maritime corridors. And the focal point of all this activity? Venezuela. Now, if you've been paying attention to global affairs, you know Venezuela isn't just a troubled neighbor. It's a failed state run by dictator Nicolas Maduro, who's been propped up by foreign adversaries and narco-terrorist cartels for years. And those cartels, they're not just Venezuela's problem. They're ours. Because the drugs flowing out of South America don't stop at the border. They end up in American communities, destroying families and fueling violent crime. So when the Trump administration began positioning military assets off the Venezuelan coast, it wasn't a random show of force. It was a calculated message. And the message was simple. We know what you're doing, we know where you're operating, and we're not going to let it continue. Think about it like this. Imagine you're trying to stop a leak in your house. You can keep mopping up the water on the floor, or you can go find the source of the leak and fix it. For decades, U.S. policy has been focused on mopping up, arresting drug dealers, intercepting shipments at the border, treating addiction after it's taken hold. All of that is important, don't get me wrong. But it's reactive. What Trump ordered was proactive. He went after the source. Now, here's where the narrative gets even more layered. Because this wasn't just about intercepting boats or sending a message to Maduro. This was about disrupting an entire ecosystem of narco-terrorism. And that ecosystem is more complex than most people realize. You've got cartels operating with military-grade weapons. You've got corrupt government officials facilitating smuggling routes. You've got terrorist organizations using drug profits to fund operations around the world. It's not just crime, it's a transnational security threat. And yet, when Trump ordered these strikes, when U.S. forces began taking out narco-terrorist targets in international waters, what was the reaction from some corners of Washington? Outrage. Accusations of illegality. Claims that the president was acting as judge, jury, and executioner. One lawmaker even went so far as to say Trump was applying the death penalty for drug dealing without due process. Let me pause here and ask you, do you think terrorists operating in hostile waters, killing Americans with drugs, deserve the same legal protections as U.S. citizens standing trial in a courtroom? Because that's the crux of the debate. On one side, you have people arguing for procedural purity. Every target needs to be vetted. Every strike needs congressional approval. Every action needs to follow peacetime legal standards. On the other side, you have people like Senator John Kennedy, who plainly said, these are terrorists. They're killing our children with drugs. They're just as dangerous as jihadists in the Sahel or Afghanistan, and the president is doing something about it. I think about this a lot, actually. The balance between ideals and survival. We want to believe that if we just follow the rules, everything will work out. But sometimes the people you're up against aren't playing by the same rules. And if you insist on tying your own hands while they operate freely, you're not being principled, you're being naive. That doesn't mean you abandon your values. It means you recognize that protection sometimes requires decisiveness. And decisiveness in the fog of a real threat doesn't always come with a committee meeting and a press release. So, while critics in Congress were drafting strongly worded letters, Trump's order was already in motion. Strikes were being carried out, smuggling routes were being disrupted, cartel leaders were being eliminated, and the result? A measurable impact on the flow of drugs heading toward U.S. borders. Not a complete solution, nothing ever is, but a shift, a recalibration of power. And here's the part that really matters. Maduro, the dictator sitting in Caracas, suddenly found himself in a very uncomfortable position, because for years he'd operated with impunity, knowing that the international community would wring its hands but never act. Now he's watching U.S. military assets just off his coast, watching his narco-terrorist allies getting picked off one by one, and wondering if he's next. But even as all of this was unfolding on the global stage, the chaos back home was reaching a fever pitch. Because while the Pentagon was executing surgical strikes in the Caribbean, ICE agents were conducting enforcement operations in American cities. And that's where the protesters come in. You've probably seen the videos by now. They went viral almost instantly. A group of activists, some genuinely concerned citizens, others professional agitators, surrounded an ICE vehicle in broad daylight. They weren't just protesting, they were actively trying to free a detainee who'd already been arrested for immigration violations. One person yanked open the vehicle door, others tried to pull the individual out, and in the midst of this, ICE agents had to make a split-second decision. Do we let this happen, or do we enforce the law? They chose enforcement, and what happened next became a flashpoint. Arrests, accusations of excessive force, outrage on social media, and here's the part that often gets overlooked, a clear demonstration of the consequences when activism crosses the line into obstruction. Let me be clear. I believe in the right to protest. I believe in free speech, in civil discourse, in holding power accountable. But there's a difference between protesting a policy and physically interfering with law enforcement officers doing their job. And that difference matters. Because the moment you try to forcibly remove someone from federal custody, you're not a protester anymore. You're breaking the law. And officers have a responsibility to respond. Now, here's what's fascinating from a strategic standpoint. These confrontations didn't hurt Trump's position. If anything, they reinforced it. Because for every viral video of activists clashing with ICE, there were millions of Americans, many of them moderate, many of them unsure about immigration policy, who looked at that chaos and thought, that's not okay. It became a visual argument for the very policies Trump was pushing: law and order, enforcement, consequences. And that brings me back to the original point. This entire sequence of events, from the nuclear option in the Senate, to the military operations near Venezuela, to the enforcement actions at home, wasn't a series of random reactions. It was a coordinated strategy. Each piece reinforced the others. The Shutdown resolution demonstrated control. The Venezuela strikes demonstrated strength. And the enforcement actions demonstrated follow-through. You know, when I think about systems, whether it's a supply chain, a spacecraft, or a government, one principle always holds true. Alignment is everything. If your components are working at cross purposes, the system fails. But if every part is synchronized toward a common objective, you get something powerful. Something that moves faster and hits harder than anyone expected. That's what happened here. And while the media was scrambling to cover each individual story, they missed the bigger picture. This wasn't three separate crises. It was one operation executed on multiple fronts. And the people who underestimated that coordination, they got outmaneuvered. Now, the protesters weren't the only ones caught off guard. Because while activists were clashing with federal agents in the streets, another battle was raging, and this one was fought with headlines, sound bites, and speculation. The media, to put it bluntly, went into overdrive. And in their rush to frame the narrative, they ended up doing something fascinating. They amplified the very confusion that worked in Trump's favor. Think about it. One network was running breaking news alerts about imminent military strikes on Venezuela. Another was interviewing constitutional scholars, debating whether the Caribbean operations were legal. A third was covering the ICE confrontations as civil rights violations. And through it all, nobody seemed to step back and ask the most important question: what if all of this is connected? What if the chaos we're seeing isn't a breakdown of order, but a deliberate application of pressure across multiple fronts? You see, there's something counterintuitive about modern information warfare. Most people assume clarity is always the goal, that leaders want everyone to understand exactly what they're doing and why. But that's not always true. Sometimes strategic ambiguity is the point. When your opponents don't know which move to counter first, when they're scrambling to respond to 3 different crises at once, they make mistakes, they overextend, they contradict themselves, and while they're busy putting out fires, you're reshaping the landscape. That's not dishonesty, it's strategy. And if you've ever run a business, managed a complex project, or even organized a large family gathering, you know what I'm talking about. You don't announce every decision in advance. You don't telegraph your next move to people who might try to stop you. You act with purpose, and you let the results speak for themselves. So when the media couldn't agree on whether this was a humanitarian mission, a military operation, a political stunt, or a constitutional crisis, that ambiguity wasn't a bug, it was a feature. Because while pundits were arguing over definitions, tangible things were happening, drug shipments were being interdicted, cartel networks were being disrupted, federal employees were getting back to work, and families were starting to see SNAP benefits come through again, even as judges stepped in to force compliance with existing law. Now, let's talk about those judges for a moment, because this is where the story gets even more interesting. 2 federal judges operating independently in different jurisdictions both ruled that the Trump administration had to continue paying out SNAP benefits during the shutdown. The legal reasoning was straightforward. The statute authorizing the program doesn't give the executive branch discretion to halt payments just because Congress hasn't passed a budget. The money is appropriated by law, and the law doesn't pause during political fights. On the surface, this might look like a loss for Trump, but here's the thing, it wasn't. Because those rulings didn't undermine his position, they actually reinforced the broader narrative he'd been building. Think about it. The courts stepped in and said the benefits must be paid, and what was the administration's response? Essentially, fine, we'll comply with the court order. But this proves exactly what we've been saying. The system is broken, and we need the Senate to act. It turned a legal defeat into a political win, because now the pressure was back on Congress, and Trump could claim he was simply following judicial orders. You know, there's a lesson in that for all of us. Sometimes the best response to opposition isn't confrontation, it's adaptation. When someone blocks your path, you don't always need to break through the wall. Sometimes you just reroute and let their obstruction become part of your argument. It's like water finding its way downhill. It doesn't fight gravity, it uses it. But let's zoom out for a second, because I want you to see the full chessboard here. We've talked about the domestic shutdown, the nuclear option, the Venezuela operations, the ICE enforcement, the media frenzy, and the court rulings. Each of those, on its own, is a significant event, but together they form something much more sophisticated. They form a system of leverage. Here's what I mean. Imagine you're negotiating, doesn't matter what for, could be anything. If you only have one point of pressure, your opponent can focus all their energy on resisting that one thing. But if you have multiple points of pressure, all applied simultaneously, they have to make choices. They have to decide what to defend, what to concede, where to push back. And while they're making those calculations, you're controlling the tempo of the entire negotiation. That's what Trump did here. He wasn't just fighting one battle, he was fighting 5 or 6 at once, and each one created leverage for the others. The shutdown fight gave him leverage over Congress. The Venezuela operations gave him leverage over foreign actors and domestic critics who'd been dismissive of his security policies. The ICE enforcement gave him leverage over immigration activists and sanctuary jurisdictions. And the court rulings, even when they went against him, gave him leverage over public opinion because he could position himself as the reasonable actor being blocked by partisans. It's multidimensional strategy. And the reason most people didn't see it coming is because we're conditioned to think of politics as linear. We expect one issue at a time, one response at a time, one news cycle at a time. But Trump doesn't operate that way. He never has. He throws multiple variables into play simultaneously, and he watches to see who can keep up. Now, some people call that chaos. I call it high-stakes problem-solving. Because the reality is, the challenges we're facing as a country, drug trafficking, illegal immigration, government dysfunction, geopolitical threats, they're not isolated problems. They're interconnected. And if you try to solve them one at a time, using the slow, cautious, consensus-driven approach that Washington prefers, you'll never get ahead of the curve. You'll always be reactive, always playing defense. What Trump did, whether you agree with his methods or not, was go on offense. He seized the initiative, and in doing so, he forced everyone else to respond to him, rather than the other way around. That's leadership under pressure. That's decision-making when the stakes are real. And here's the part that I think matters most for all of us watching this unfold. The broader consequences of this moment extend far beyond the immediate policy wins or losses. Because what we're witnessing is a fundamental shift in how power operates in the modern era. The old playbook, the one where you build coalitions, negotiate compromises, move incrementally, and hope public opinion eventually comes around, that playbook assumed a certain amount of good faith on all sides. It assumed that if you played by the rules, others would too. But we've learned over the past couple of decades that assumption no longer holds. When one side is willing to use every procedural tool, every media advantage, every institutional lever at their disposal, and the other side insists on unilateral restraint, the outcome is predictable. The restrained side loses. Not because their ideas are worse, but because they've handicapped themselves in the fight. So what happens now? What are the broader consequences of Trump's latest moves? Let's start with Venezuela. If Maduro's regime is genuinely destabilized, if the pressure from U.S. operations combined with internal unrest and economic collapse finally forces a transition of power that's a seismic shift for the entire region, it would mean one less hostile actor on America's doorstep. It would mean millions of Venezuelan refugees could potentially return home instead of flooding neighboring countries and straining resources. And it would send a message to other rogue regimes. Alignment with our adversaries has consequences. But there's a flip side. Regime change is messy. History is full of examples where removing a dictator created a power vacuum that led to even worse outcomes. So the question isn't just can we topple Maduro, it's what comes next. And that's where the real test of strategy lies, not in the initial strike, but in the follow-through, in the stabilization, in the long-term plan. On the domestic front, the consequences are just as significant. The use of the nuclear option, the aggressive ICE enforcement, the willingness to bypass traditional norms, all of that sets precedents. Some people will cheer. Others will worry that we're eroding the checks and balances that keep our system stable. And honestly, both reactions are valid, because precedents cut both ways. The tools Trump is using today will be available to his successors tomorrow, and we may not always agree with how they're used. But here's what I keep coming back to. Stability isn't the absence of conflict. It's the ability to weather conflict and come out stronger on the other side. And right now, America is in the middle of a stress test. The shutdown tested our resilience. The Venezuela operations tested our resolve. The enforcement actions tested our commitment to the rule of law. And the political battles tested our capacity for self-governance. So far, the system is holding. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but it's holding. And that matters. Because for all the talk of chaos and crisis, the reality is that the fundamental institutions, courts, military, elections, civil society are still functioning. They're being strained, yes. They're being challenged, absolutely. But they haven't collapsed. And as long as they don't, we have a path forward. Now, I want to shift gears for a moment and talk about something that often gets lost in these big strategic debates. The human element. Because while we've been discussing geopolitics and legislative tactics, there are real people affected by all of this. Federal workers who went a month without pay and are now wondering if it'll happen again. Families who depend on food assistance and spend sleepless nights worrying about how they'd make ends meet. Immigrants, both legal and undocumented, living in fear of enforcement actions. Communities dealing with the opioid crisis that's fueled by the very cartels Trump is targeting. These aren't abstract policy questions. They're lived experiences. And one of the responsibilities we all share, whether we're leaders or citizens, is to hold both truths at once: the strategic necessity of tough decisions and the human cost of those decisions. You can believe that securing the border is essential and still feel compassion for the individuals caught in that process. You can support strong action against narco-terrorists and still mourn the lives lost to addiction here at home. These things aren't contradictory. They're the full picture. And I think that's where a lot of our national discourse falls short. We've gotten so used to binary thinking: you're either with us or against us, either pro-Trump or anti-Trump, either hardline or soft, that we've lost the ability to hold complexity. But life is complex. Leadership is complex. And the challenges we face don't fit neatly into ideological boxes. So when I look at what just happened, this coordinated sequence of moves across multiple fronts, I don't see it as proof that one side is right and the other's wrong. I see it as a case study in how power operates under pressure, and the lessons from that case study apply no matter where you sit on the political spectrum. Lesson 1. Timing matters. Trump didn't wait for perfect conditions. He acted when the moment presented itself, even though the risks were high. Sometimes waiting for consensus means waiting forever. Lesson 2. Coordination amplifies impact. None of these individual actions would have been as effective in isolation, but together they created a force multiplier. That's true in business, in engineering, in community organizing, anywhere people are trying to accomplish something difficult. Lesson 3. Expect resistance and plan for it. Trump knew the courts might push back. He knew the media would criticize. He knew activists would protest. And he went ahead anyway, because he had already calculated that the resistance was manageable and the objective was worth it. Lesson 4. Narrative matters, but results matter more. The media can spin a story 100 different ways, but at the end of the day, people judge leaders by outcomes. Did the government reopen? Is the border more secure? Those are the questions that will shape the long-term verdict on this moment. And that brings me to where we are right now. In one sense, the crisis has passed, but in another sense, it hasn't. Because the underlying tensions, the political polarization, the institutional gridlock, the security threats, the economic pressures, those are still with us. This wasn't a resolution. It was a reprieve. And the next chapter is already being written. What will that chapter look like? Honestly, nobody knows for sure. But here's what I believe. The next few years will test us in ways we haven't been tested in generations. We're going to face more shutdowns, more standoffs, more moments where the old rules don't seem to apply anymore. And in those moments, we're going to have to decide what kind of country we want to be. Do we want to be a country that clings to procedures even when they're failing us? Or do we want to be a country that adapts, improvises, and finds new ways forward? Do we want leaders who play it safe and avoid controversy? Or do we want leaders who take risks and accept responsibility for the outcomes? These aren't easy questions, and reasonable people will disagree on the answers. But here's what I hope we can all agree on. We need clarity. We need honesty about the challenges we face and the trade-offs required to address them. We need fewer talking points and more straight talk. And we need to resist the temptation to view everything through a partisan lens, because the problems we're dealing with don't belong to one party or the other. They belong to all of us. And that means the solutions have to come from all of us too. Not just from the White House, not just from Congress, not just from activists or experts or media figures, from citizens, from you and me. From people who are willing to stay informed, think critically, and engage in the messy, frustrating, essential work of self-governance. So if today's story taught us anything, it's this. Power doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's exercised, challenged, checked, and recalibrated constantly. And the people who shape the future aren't the ones who wait for permission. They're the ones who see an opportunity, calculate the risks, and act with conviction. Trump gave the order. The protesters miscalculated. The system bent but didn't break. And now we're left with the consequences, some intended, some not, all significant. The question isn't whether you agree with every move that was made. The question is, what do we do next? Because here's the thing about moments like this, they reveal who we are. They show us what we're capable of, for better or worse. They test our principles, our patience, and our capacity to adapt. And they set the stage for what comes after. If today's deep dive gave you a different perspective on what's really happening behind the headlines, take a second to like this video. It helps us reach more people who want context, not noise. Subscribe if you believe clarity still matters, and share your take in the comments. Do you think Trump's latest move was bold strategy or reckless gamble? I'll be reading every reply. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just a story about one order or one president. It's a story about all of us, trying to navigate an uncertain world and build something better on the other side. And that's a conversation worth having.